All right, beautiful. To get us started, I'm curious, James, why does Seneca urge us to prepare for death?
Seneca was a Stoic philosopher, as you know, and also a consumptive, physically ill with a chronic respiratory illness that seems to have given him spells that resemble death. So when he says he rehearses for death, he has actual episodes in which he feels like he's dying, and he learned to sort of calm himself down and accept those. And also, on a philosophic plane, he regards death as a freeing of the soul, a liberation, a return of the soul to its cosmic roots, its roots in the universe, the supreme rite of passage for a philosopher. And it's the goal of philosophy, in part, to prepare the sage for that moment, for that transition.
As we were coming up on this conversation, I recently saw an advertisement for a Netflix documentary, Don't Die. Are you familiar with it, James? You're probably familiar with the figure, but it's somebody essentially trying to live forever or as long as possible. But it's something that comes up quite a bit in our modern culture, the longevity, piece of things. What do you think, Seneca or Stoic philosophers in general might say to the don't die movement or longevity?
Seneca would not have thought much of that effort. He speaks many times in his writings about the length of life, lifespan, not being a measure of the quality of life. He takes the case of centenarians, people who are 100 years old, who are looking back on their life and counting up all the days that they wasted on the law courts or on business or on dinner parties. He has a whole list of useless endeavors that have consumed most of those 100 years. And he says those people are actually dying young because
Mm.
they've only lived, really fully lived, for a short portion of that century. And conversely, someone who dies young in their teens or 20s might have lived so fully that they feel like they've had a full life and that there's no reason to mourn their passing. So he's entirely against this idea that happiness or fulfillment can be measured in length of life. It's all about the quality of life.
Yeah. And it's interesting, this focus on it's something we learn. And he speaks a number of times in some of these letters to his friends Lucilius that he's come to these things later in life, and it's not that he was one of these that had it figured out or completely hasn't figured out. So in the way of learning, how would Seneca suggest we learn to die, or where does this preparation for death begin?
Well, really, it begins from birth. Seneca says if we talk about terminal patients, terminal cancer patients, and say they're dying. But really, you look at an infant and you could say the same thing. We're dying from day one, dying every day, as the title of your podcast has it, and the title of my book about Seneca at the Court of Nero. Life is a journey toward death. That's his essential perspective.
And one of the things he talks about, and it comes up in your book, How to Die, which I recently read, is the aspect of fear. There's an underlying fear of death. What do we do with that? How do we overcome the fear of death?
Well, that's complicated by the question of what Seneca thinks is going to follow death. And he's not clear on what he thinks about that. In some passages, he talks about the soul being immortal and rejoining a kind of universal soul in the cosmos. In other places, he talks about total dissolution, our atoms dissolving and becoming part of the earth, part of nature. He's quite sure that we're not going to some kind of Hades in which souls that have been wicked or are being punished will undergo torment by the monsters of the underworld. So that's one thing that we can eliminate. We don't need to be afraid of what's awaiting us after death. Either it's going to be a blissful or a redemptive experience, a rejoining of this cosmic mind, or it's going to be nothing at all. We'll have no sensation and no consciousness, so therefore there's nothing to fear. He compares the state of being dead to the state that we were in before we were born. We weren't conscious of any lack, anything to be afraid of before we were born, because we weren't. We had no consciousness. And so it'll be just the same after death.
And there's the Delphic maxim, many, and there's one that comes to mind is, think as a mortal. How do you think, in your view, like coming to grip with some of this, how does it affect the day to day? How does it affect, as we navigate the more mundane aspects of life?
The idea that we have to think as immortal, you mean?
Yeah, just accepting, mortality, having it maybe in the back of the mind, which I would assume, Seneca did much more than most, as much as it comes up in some of his letters and writing.
Well, this bears on the topic of time, which I explored in the volume that I did for Princeton called How to Have a Life, which is principally about Seneca's thoughts on time and the use of time. We count up our money on a regular basis, so we're aware that we have a limited supply of money. We have to budget it. We have to spend it. If you're planning for retirement, you have to make sure you have enough to cover your lifespan. We don't do the same kinds of calculations about time, but time is actually much more precious than money.
Mm.
And yet we act as though we have an infinite supply of it. At least young people do, and we're not aware of the limits. So the passages that I excerpted in How to Have a Life, which come principally from his work De Brevitate Vitae, on the shortness of life, are all about how to properly look at time, how to value it as a commodity that is in limited supply, and therefore to use it well and not allow other people to steal it, just like we wouldn't allow people to steal our property. We shouldn't allow people to steal our time by making banal, idle demands on us. And we shouldn't waste it by staring at our screens, by,
Yeah.
surfing the internet mindlessly, or the countless ways in which we squander time.
In your own experience, you mentioned there the young. Do you think this is something you've changed your perspective on in the way of the years? If you can think back a couple decades ago, are you thinking about time differently today?
Yes, I think so. I think almost everyone thinks differently as they age. I'm 66, and I'm more inclined now than I was in my 30s to say, life's too short. I'm not going to get sucked into that black hole, that time suck, because life's too short. I think that's an expression that Seneca would have appreciated.
Yeah. There's another maxim that we've been chatting about a bit on this podcast, or focusing on, in a way of know thyself. I don't know. I'm curious whether it's memento mori or, Stoicism more broadly speaking. How do you think it helps us to know something about who we are?
The it being Stoicism, or what?
Yeah, Stoicism or memento mori, if you'd like to think about it in terms of that. But either or, yeah, I'm just curious about the project of know thyself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose, philosophy is very inward directed, at least for the Stoics. It's about the soul, and it's about each of us taking account with our own souls of our ethical behavior, our connection to nature, to the universe. Seneca describes an experience that he took part in on a daily basis, in which he, at the end of each day, reviewed things that he'd done wrong that day places he'd gotten angry with someone unreasonably or lost his temper, lost his patience. And he tells himself on every occasion, that was an understandable error, but just don't do that again. He does what we would call a kind of a meditation on his own behavior. So, that for him was knowing himself, taking a kind of account, making a spiritual accounting of how his behavior fit into his own ethical principles, which is what's so confusing about Seneca, because we know that in his political career as the chief minister of Nero, he often did things that didn't fit in with his ethical principles. And the regime of which he was a part was not at all in line with Stoic ethical principles. So he had to walk a very fine line. Many people feel he was a rank hypocrite and we shouldn't believe anything he says because he didn't walk the walk. I don't see things quite that way, but I think that there is a real problem in reading Seneca in squaring the beliefs with the political activities.
Yeah. I don't know, it's interesting. I understand some of the, I guess, objections to Seneca or some of the hesitations sometimes, but then I don't know, I observe myself a bit and I see that I'm kind of a walking bag of contradictions at times and one mistake after the next. I do appreciate some of the language in his letters of that he's not a sage, kind of this image of he's another sick person in a bed next to you that needs philosophy as much as the next. And I think that does, in the way of know thyself, at least an aspect of it is, well, one thing at least I can say is I'm not a sage. So there's a starting point. I'm a person that's maybe going to make mistakes. And he seems to suggest, and you talked about it a bit in the way of, some sort of self-forgiveness. It's not something, and maybe this is more of a modern culture thing of where you can get into this really like beating yourself up and self-guilt and shame and stuff like that. How do we learn to like let go of some of that? What do you think Seneca can teach us about self-forgiveness and, moving on, accepting that the fact that not only we're mortal, but that we're not sages as well?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because, of course, if you forgive yourself everything, then you don't have much motivation to improve. Seneca perhaps forgave himself things that he shouldn't have, but he does call himself a proficiscens in Latin, a person who is on the road to self-improvement, not fully complete. And of course, almost everyone in the human race fits into that category. He only really saw one or two people in all of human history who had attained the status of the sapiens, the sage, who always knows what to do, always behaves according to universal principles, the harmony with the nature and with the cosmos that was so important to the Stoics. Socrates was one such person. But the rest of us are all on the road in one way or another. We're as drivers, and we'll never get there, but this driving is still important and really the essence of a philosophic life.